Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alina Bain. I'm CEO of the Export Council of Australia. Welcome to our webinar this afternoon with Coface and FTI. To introduce the topic, we've observed at the ECA that many Australian SMEs and mid-sized companies find global business challenging, and they need assistance to navigate the complexities and to take advantage of the opportunities. The Export Council of Australia exists to provide support to its members and to help them to go global sustainably. And we do this by educating, advocating and promoting Australian businesses to take up the challenge. For today's topic, we have looked at the complexity of exporting goods and services to countries around the world. And we appreciate this from our conversations with our members. We know because here at Coface, the Export Council of Australia and FTI Consulting, we see our clients and members run into roadblocks, and this prevents their businesses from operating as efficiently and profitably as they should. Luckily, many of these obstacles don't need to cause as much of an issue as they currently do. Instead, taking a few simple actions, by doing more research and being aware of the dangers, we can have a huge impact on the smooth running of an organisation's export operations. We've learned that businesses who take these steps make everyone's lives easier, but those who don't will undoubtedly run into trouble sooner or later. To ensure that your business falls into the first category, we'll be making sure that you know what the obstacles are and how to avoid them. Today, we're very lucky to be joined by two speakers. I'll introduce them to you and then I'll hand over to them to take you through a presentation, and we'll finish up with a Q&A at the end. So firstly, to introduce our speakers, we have Chris Little, Commercial Director of Coface, joining us. Chris's focus is strong risk management to promote sustainable business growth. He specialises in trade credit insurance and has over 10 years of experience in risk assessment and analysis, creating growth strategies for Australian businesses by matching the appropriate risk exposure to business needs and requirements. His company, Coface, has over 70 years experience in global trade. With data on 80 million businesses worldwide, they make over 10,000 risk decisions every single day. For unparalleled expertise in trade credit risk, we partner with Coface to provide a complete view of your customers. We'll also be hearing from Murray Lawson today. Murray is Managing Director from FTI Consulting. He specialises in leading cross-border fraud, corruption and business intelligence investigations. He has worked extensively with major corporate and investment industry clients on assessing and managing issues related to reputational risk, fraud, corruption, human rights and shareholder activism. A little bit about FTI Consulting. FTI Consulting is an independent global business advisory firm. They are dedicated to helping organisations manage change, mitigate risk and resolve disputes in the areas of financial, legal, operational, political and regulatory, reputational and transactional. Individually, each practice is a leader in its specific field, staffed with experts recognised for the depth of their knowledge and a track record of making an impact. We're very lucky to have both Murray and Chris with us today. So with that introduction, I'll now hand over to Chris to begin the presentation. Thank you all.
Thank you, Alina, for those kind words. I suppose the first thing I'd like to say is that I'm sitting in a office, or our Coface office in Tokyo. So in the spirit of globalization, I'll say to you all, konnichiwa. It's a great opportunity for me to speak to you today about this topic. So I hope you get a lot out of it. In terms of the slides, I'll be looking at the first 6 slides, and then Murray will provide details through the last 4. In terms of what I'm going to speak about, looking at, I think there's 3 overriding themes in relation to what I'll talk about. One is know who you are dealing with, who is the debtor, who is the customer. Second is in an organisation, have a balance between sales and credit management. And the third theme is to act quickly when you know something is wrong. So I'll come back to those themes several times during this presentation. So in terms of dealing with difficulties with corporate ghosts, okay, so I suppose the first question is obviously, what is a corporate ghost? A corporate ghost is a realization that you were dealing with a company, not an individual. So you may have signed up with an individual in a company, but obviously when you start dealing with a company and things go wrong, you're dealing with a big complexity and a big machine. I think there's a lot of excitement when a company gets a deal or enters a new country, or they get a deal with a big new supplier. But it gets back to my first point that you really need to know who your customer is. So that should be your first question. That should be your starting point, your strategy. How am I dealing, or who am I dealing with, and how do I find out about them? So there's probably several means you can find out about your clients, be that through a mercantile agent, through trade references, or even speaking with other suppliers. And I suppose from an export side, that you then need to decide what terms you're going to offer to this client. Are you going to trade on secure terms like letter of credit, or are you going to take a more cost-effective approach like open account and possibly backed with a trade credit insurance policy? In relation to big retailers, obviously we know from local experience that, you know, dealing with companies like Coles and Woolies in Australia, they're notorious for demanding extended terms and stretching out payments, and that's probably no different with other big retailers throughout the globe. So in terms of a strategy of how to deal with these large retailers and the like, I suppose the first question to ask is, you know, can the company absorb such long terms? You know, they're great to have on your client list, but the key question is, can your cash flow absorb such long payment terms and any delays that may come with dealing with such a company? So on to the next slide. We're dealing with Goalpost Shifters. So this is probably every credit manager's least favourite situation to deal with. So in talking about Goalpost Shifters, it really relates to my points 1 and 3. You know who you're dealing with, and 3, act quickly when something is wrong. So as I said on the previous slide, when trading with a new company, do your research. You know, get credit reports, get mercantile reports. They'll provide details on a company's history, company's trading experience, the company's financials, possibly. So you'll get a full picture and know exactly who you're dealing with. The other thing to consider is if you are engaging with a D&D, Veda, or a Coface, someone that's supplying information, is if the buy is not on that mercantile agent's database, why not? It generally means that company's either is trading on COD, or that they're new. So I think we're all cognizant of the facts or the stats around the insolvency rates around companies in their first 2 to 3 years. So if you are dealing with a new company, you need to consider whether A, you should deal with them, and B, what kind of terms you're going to offer them. In terms of payment terms, obviously we speak to a lot of companies, both locally and globally, who deal domestically and export-wise. So I suppose that you look at the companies that are successful, I suppose there's a couple of common themes or strategies. I think one of the key things is to make sure that your terms match the industry standard. No use offering longer terms if the rest of the market is offering shorter terms, because it's going to impact on your business and your cash flow, etc. So if I use a domestic scenario, if your terms are 30 days end of month, stick to it. Don't be offering 60 days end of month or 90 days end of month, because you've got to ask yourself, why would you extend terms to one specific buyer? Is it worth it? If you look at the export scenario, then it comes down to what terms should you offer. Should you go the secure term route, the letter of credit or CAD, or should you look at the open account scenario? And if you are going down the open account scenario, then you need to even even more important to know who you're dealing with and have a strategy. And that strategy may entail hedging against currency fluctuation or taking a trade credit insurance policy out. So we're often surprised how many companies we actually speak to that don't know about the buyers or the markets they're entering. So, for instance, when take China, for example, like when companies go there for the first time, a lot of them don't really know who they're dealing with on the ground there, and they're unaware of things like import restrictions and import quotas, etc. So to finish off here, I think just to reconfirm, make sure you know who you are dealing with. So in terms of misunderstanding tariffs, so obviously tariffs is a high-profile issue at the moment, an unfortunate part of the modern world. Obviously, Trump's the sort of headline thing, but also, we've had Russian tariffs in the past, and obviously some recent ones in India as well. So it's an unfortunate part of the modern world. As a company, Coface is diametrically opposed to tariffs. Our new tagline or theme for the company is "For Trade." And when I visit people, or when our staff visit people, I suppose one of the first things we're always asked is what we do. But as my boss would always say, the first starting point should be why we do. Coface, as mentioned in the introduction, has been around for 70 years, has a footprint in 65 countries, offering trade credit insurance and collection and information services. So our business is the promotion of free trade. We're in the business of enhancing globalization. So obviously tariffs are something we're opposed to, but unfortunately they are the reality of the modern world. So in terms of a recent example that we've seen, some of you may be aware that of the tariffs that India imposed on lentils toward the end of last year and further again into 2018. This was a quite strong example because it wasn't just about future trade with a drop dead date. It was actually from the moment it was legislated. So it not only affected people that had trade set up, but actually people with shipments on the water. So what's really key here is to know your markets. So you need to keep up to date with all the news and all the information about the markets and your buyers. So there needs to be a constant communication with the buyers and also a constant communication with local entities. So keep in touch with your industry body, keep in touch with entities like ECA, ask questions of your trade credit insurer or mercantile agent, find out what's happening. So if you look at that Indian lentil story, obviously once it came to light, we spoke to our local clients who were supplying lentils into India. And it was interesting to see that those that did have that communication chain or had been following the news were well prepared. They'd either exited or really cut back on shipments leading up to the tariffs being imposed, or it basically flooded the market in preparation. But it's a good illustration that communication and knowledge is really imperative when you're dealing with tariffs. Okay, so on to the next slide, which is relationships with gold diggers. So Coface, we have data on sectors in relation to payment records, which we have both across local, regional, and global markets. So textiles and papers have always featured heavily in what we would consider the high risk sector. Internally, we have a traffic light system, and obviously high risk is red, and textiles and papers regularly appear in Australia, in the region, and across the globe itself. Metals tends to fluctuate. As we're probably aware, there's a lot of changes in prices, in supply demand, particularly coming out of China in recent years. So this really speaks to the Western Australian story. So metals is something that we have seen deteriorate and have paid significant claims on regionally, but on the flip side, I think we're starting to see things brighten up a bit. In terms of what gold diggers are and how they manifest themselves, it's often in an export scenario in the situation of a contract repudiation. So in terms of contract repudiation, I'll just run through the what, why, and how to deal with. So in terms of what contract repudiation is, it's basically when a debtor refuses to take goods or wants to renegotiate the price. Now, this is generally the case when there's a massive currency exchange difference or price variance, or they believe that they can renegotiate with the supplier. This is particularly prevalent where the supplier may be supplying things like perishable goods, fruit and veg, or things like live cattle, because they believe they've effectively they may have the supplier over the barrel. How do they do it? So these debtors will often cite dispute. They may say that the wrong goods were delivered, they were the wrong shape, they were faulty, they were damaged, etc. And they use that as the smoke screen to try and renegotiate price. So I suppose that brings the question is how to deal with. I suppose there's three methods that we see. One is to renegotiate the price, which obviously means taking your haircut. So what we often see too is that some suppliers will often try and negotiate very high price to actually offset any renegotiation that they may need to do when entering a country. The second option is to ship to another supplier, either in the country or port you're at, or actually to take the shipment to another port and supply someone else. But obviously, generally that means taking a haircut as well on the original sales contract cost. Or the third method is to take legal action, which obviously in some markets is a long, laborious and fruitless exercise. So I suppose I think a lot of people on the first time they're exporting, when they come up against a contract repudiation scenario, are quite surprised. But I suppose it's just recognising and realising that different countries have different attitudes to contracts and different customs when it comes to negotiation. So it gets back to that point too about knowing your market and knowing your buyer. So in terms of the solution of how you could deal with the scenario, obviously the options I mentioned, one and two, renegotiate with haircut or ship to another port with possible haircut. So this is where a trade credit insurance policy may come in handy. So a trade credit insurer like Coface will reimburse a percentage of the shortfall of the resale value between the original payment contract and what you had to pay to the end, or the second or the end supplier. And second, we also have an option or a bolt-on module to our contracts at a cost called disputed debts, which enables our client to make a claim of up to 70% of the sales contract value, and from that point on, they then need to get a legal outcome in their favour to get the rest of the claim paid out. So on to the next slide, which is delayed reactions, which centres in on SMEs. So and this really speaks to the second concept I raised, which is the balance between the sales and credit within an organisation. So I suppose we see that the best practice is that salespeople are out on the road, knocking on doors, doing whatever they need to do, and making potential sales, and then getting that deal approved by a credit management team or a credit process. We see this with big multinationals, we see it with banks, and realistically it should be the same path that SMEs use as well. So SMEs, when they're going to an overseas market, need to have a real strict process. So the first point is, or first strategy or basis should be, how do I check my clients? Am I going to outsource to a mercantile agent, or am I going to use something internal? Second point is all the documentation correct? If you are using internal checks, is the application form filled out correctly with all the data is do the trade references stack up? Is the sales contract in the name of the right entity you're trading with? Thirdly, you need a process which is watertight in terms of sending goods and raising invoices. Effectively, if no invoice or no purchase order, effectively, your legal rights are next to nothing. So it's important that process is watertight and done 100% of the time. Fourthly, you need a stringent follow-up process when something is overdue. So if you're, whatever the terms you may have, 60 days, for instance, as an example, on day 61, you should be on the phone or sending letters or making contact with buyer or debtor in terms of where's my money, when am I going to get paid, and then have a process, be it internal or outsourced, about how you're actually going to chase that money. So at day 40 we do X, at day 50 we do Y, day 70 we go legal, etc. And then lastly, you also need a policy if you're dealing with serial offenders in this space. So if you're dealing with a debtor that's constantly changing terms or wanting to extend terms, etc., what's your strategy going to be around dealing with that client? Are you going to put them on stricter terms, or are you just not going to deal with them at all? So what we see very often after a claim, when we process a claim at Coface and talk to our client, is that export, but particularly on domestic side, people will say, "Oh, I've been dealing with this person for years. There's never been an issue. There was a couple of late payments near the end, but we were assured that everything was going to be okay." I think in the Australian context, we rely a lot on reputation and relationship in terms of chasing money and trusting people, and I think that's a good part. But you should never forget the data. So if things are going bad, if payment terms are starting to be blown out, you need to take action. Which brings us to the next slide, which is the failure to notice fake moustaches, I should say. So in essence here, we're talking about Phoenix companies, and this really talks to my process around 1, knowing who you're dealing with, and 3, acting quickly. In fact, it talks to the whole 3, 1, 2, and 3, and also the balance between sales and credit. So I suppose we all know what Phoenix companies are: companies that start up after another one is shut down, closed, and effectively doing the same thing with the same people. So as the numbers illustrate up there, it costs Australia billions of dollars a year. So what allows it to happen? I suppose one is probably the legal loophole, but secondly, more prevalently, I think that suppliers still want to deal with these companies. Suppliers didn't deal with Phoenix companies. I suppose we wouldn't have this number, or this big number that appears up on the screen. So this really gets down to the point of know your customer. So if you've got a mercantile report in front of you, and the shareholder or director has been on failed companies, or you notice that the director is the wife or the son of a failed businessman, then this should really be a red light about who should you really deal with this company. I suppose a Phoenix company is, from our experience too, they're either blatant or pretty well hidden. I say blatant because you'll see instances where you'll have the company, for instance, called, I don't know, ABC Proprietary Limited. It'll close down, and then a month later, ABC1 Proprietary Limited will start up either at the same place or down the road. And yet you still see scenarios where salespeople will want to deal with them. And we even have applications from our clients who've had, put in notifications on an overdue, and then still want to trade with a Phoenix company, which is very surprising. But often that's not as blatant as that. So this is when you need to do your research. If the name does change, or the fronting people do change, you need to do your research and do some digging to see if this company has a history, and if it has a history as a Phoenix. We often see Phoenixes in our world, or in a claim scenario where there is in industries where there's a large or important piece of machinery. So for instance, say we've had in the past paper clients where their debtor has gone under, that what's happened in the lead up to the insolvency or the closing of the doors is they've moved the paper press, which is obviously the big asset of the company, and moved it up the road or into a new factory, and offered and started up a Phoenix company. So that's it about Phoenixes. So just to reiterate the three themes that I've discussed this morning. One, know who you're dealing with, or know who your customer is. Two, have a good balance between sales and credit management procedures. And three, act quickly when something is wrong. And on that note, I'll now hand over to Murray Lawson from FTI Consulting. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris. The first sort of point that I've got to speak about falls very much on that topic that Chris mentioned of knowing who you're doing business with. It's a very common scenario for my team to get called in when a deal's gone wrong, or there's been a significant loss of funds or assets as a result of a deal that's gone across a border and hasn't gone the way it's supposed to. The most common thing I ask in that situation is, well, how much did you know about the other side of the transaction before you got into it? And the answer is usually very little to none. Quite often, they've never actually met the customer or their trading partner. They haven't really had much personal contact other than email contact. They've had a few documents sent across, but really nothing to prove who these people are, or that they've got the capabilities to follow through on what undertakings they're making. But it's not just the risk of getting paid that's an issue. It's when you are dealing, particularly in international trade, there's a host of other issues that really drive home the imperative need to understand who you're doing business with. The first one I'll talk about is international trade sanctions. It's something that in Australia doesn't get a lot of notice, but there are severe criminal penalties for a company and an individual who trades with a sanctioned entity overseas. A recent study that we did in conjunction with one of our partners showed that only about 16% of businesses that were engaged in cross-border transactions were actually checking an international sanctions list to ensure that the person they're about to deal with wasn't listed on it. There's a number of things that can be done, but the most important thing is to come at the transaction with a skeptical mindset, to not necessarily just trust the information that's given to you, but to actually scrutinize it and think about, what does this mean and does it make sense? A recent example we had was a customer who came to us with a transaction that had gone bad. One of the documents they were provided was a letter of funds from HSBC, or ostensibly on HSBC letterhead, saying that this person had $1 billion in US dollars cash sitting in a HSBC account. Now, the first thing that pops up in my mind is that governments don't even keep that much cash, but no one sort of had the skeptical thought to say, this doesn't seem to make sense. And when I spoke to the client, they said, it seemed weird at the time. And I think that's one of my key take homes. If you have concerns, if something doesn't feel right, that's the time to stop, verify, check, obtain further information. Don't just try and write it off, because chances are it could be something that goes wrong. Some of the basic due diligence I encourage all of the customers and clients I deal with is Google Earth the office. Check that it is actually a building, that it's not a vacant car park. Make sure that the building sort of looks what the profile of the company should be. If it's supposed to be a multi-billion-dollar enterprise and it's running out the back of someone's garage, that should be cause for you to take a bit more of a cautious approach. Does the information you're getting about the company fit with its general profile and what they're potentially trying to get involved in? Look at the LinkedIn and Facebook sites. Does it have a company website? Is it consistent with what you'd expect that profile to be? Really trying to educate yourself as much as possible. Other sources, other than the internet, Austrade, the Australian Chambers of Commerce, can sometimes help with those sort of things, or there are professional investigations services such as my own, that if a deal is significantly high risk and significantly high value, you may actually want to have it professionally investigated to ensure that really you know as much as you can before you get involved with them. Moving on to the next one is a related topic in terms of something we see with a lot of our clients, and again, it goes to knowing more about the market that you're about to get involved in. We should always assume when you're trading, it's not just your product that you're taking, it's also your IP and it's also your brand. So there's a number of issues that you want to have a good handle on. You want to understand in the market about how do I protect my IP. For instance, in a lot of markets, you will need to register a trademark or a patent or a copyright in that local jurisdiction, and you want to do that before you enter the market. Once you get into the market, the possibility of it being duplicated or copied in some way is quite high. And if you don't have the first application in, someone else can generally apply for your trademark and start to use it. The other aspect is to really think about how your particular product and sector is thought about by the government in that other country. For example, in China, government authorities really won't take any action on a trademark violation in the fashion, Louis Vuitton handbags type space. There's just too much of it, and it's impossible for them to stop completely. Where they will take action is on anything that poses a public health concern or a safety issue. So things like automotive, health, pharmaceuticals. The government actually takes those sort of brand integrity issues really, really seriously, and you will get good cooperation if you have an issue from government authorities. When you're making agreements with companies, whether it be maybe a joint venture or an on-selling under trademark, it's really important to understand what the legal processes that needed to be gone through are. For instance, Danone, the major dairy and drinks company a few years ago, got into a licensing dispute with a brand that was very big in China. They had made agreements to the joint venture, but ultimately they'd not registered that official agreement to use that trademark with the government. So when a dispute happened, they didn't have a legal leg to stand on because it wasn't approved by the government in the first place. So you need to understand not just how a contract between businesses is understood, but what's the level of oversight and involvement of particular government authorities. The sort of underlying problem in many of these cases is the extent of that relationship. Understanding who it is, but more importantly, having a very strong relationship with them is really, really important to a successful cross-border deal. You need to understand not just the basics of how business operates in that other environment. You need to understand what is it that people value. Asian business relationships outside Australia are generally less transactional. They place a much higher premium on that personal interaction. And if you're seen as a transactional company, you will fall down their priority list in terms of whether they want to make payments to you, whether they want to prioritize you, whether you'll even get a response from them when something goes wrong. Without that personal bond, it becomes very, very difficult. But it goes beyond just observing the particular cultural etiquette and practices. It really is about understanding it at a different level. How are businesses structured and what's the purpose of business? In many Asian jurisdictions that we work, most of the companies or the large companies are family owned, which brings with it a different prioritization over just creating shareholder value, which it might be for a company in a Western jurisdiction. There's the involvement of state-owned enterprises who could be involved in it, and you need to understand how that might impact the deal, what's going to happen with it. Related business interests are very common. It can always be the case that you end up dealing with a company that you think is independent from one customer, but it's actually a very, very closely related entity. And that brings with it a risk that if you've got 10 customers, all of whom are related parties in that market, there's a really risk exposure there should that deal start to go bad with one of them. And the final point, I think, is really understanding where your knowledge gaps are and knowing what you do know and what you don't know. It's really difficult and complicated to set up a deal where you know everything, but it's about knowing what you don't know and then trying to say, to what extent can I achieve that? The key question that I think an Australian business should be asking through every stage of their exporting process is whether you know at least as much about the risks as you do about the opportunity. And we often get caught up on the opportunity and really don't think through the risks terribly carefully. It's really important to sit down and do a pre-mortem on it and say, what's the worst case scenario in this? How does that look? And am I willing to accept that risk? And if I am, then how do I limit that worst case if it eventuates? And that's where services like Coface can come in with insurance. You can have responsive plans and ensure that you're as protected as you can. The other aspect is to ensure that you keep monitoring. It's not just to set and forget at the outset of a business relationship. You need to understand it at various points throughout it. Are things still happening the way I thought they were? Is my product still ending up where I thought it was going? Am I still getting the result that we were supposed to get at the outset? Those small changes, like a customer that's usually a good payer who suddenly starts to extend their terms or miss payments, they should be signs to take a broader look at the relationship again and say, well, what's going on here? Has there been some change that I've not been aware of? Information is power in all of these situations. It can sometimes be very hard to get, but there are a number of approaches to achieving that. The mercantile reports of the likes of Chris's team and other providers, through to your own internal processes, ensuring that you capture as much information as you can, that information becomes part of the corporate knowledge and the knowledge around that relationship. And there is no substitute for a face-to-face meeting with a customer in the market when you're ready to talk to them. So I think I'll wind it up there and we can maybe move to questions.
Thanks, Murray, and thanks, Chris, both for your presentations. They were enormously helpful, and I might just kick off with a couple of questions. Murray, you talked a little bit about trademarking or securing a patent for products and goods. I was just wondering if you could provide a little bit more detail about that and perhaps turn your mind to services in particular and ways to protect intellectual property in those, and also if you've got any particular advice in relation to China.
Certainly. I think the services environment in terms of IP protection is still developing, and I'm certainly not an IP lawyer, but having seen some situations in terms of great loss of IP, I think it's really important to understand any technology transfer provisions that are being required. For instance, the automotive industry in China for a long time had to move all of their IP there if they wanted to sell. So General Motors had to partner up with a local local company and share all the IP around their products. That's given a huge kickstart to the Chinese automotive industry, and now it's at a point where they are direct competitors back into the home markets. So governments in other countries will often set government policies in order to ensure that they benefit from the sharing of IP on products that might be sold into the market. What you need to think about is not just the short-term consequences of that, but in the longer term, is there a viable co-partnership agreement, or are you creating a competitor that ultimately down the track is going to be a challenge for you? And that might want to think about how you actually structure it. What products do you take into what markets? How strong are the protections? Can you actually protect it? If you look at patent registrations, copyrights, all of the traditional sort of brand protection mechanisms, you want to get a very good understanding of how well those things function and how much protection do you actually have. Most countries will have some mechanism, but without some practical advice from a legal team who know those markets about how well does it work, what are your chances of actually taking legal action if something goes wrong? And what you quite often find is that many of the IP protection frameworks don't really operate all that well when the rubber hits the road. In terms of China, I think it varies greatly across different sectors, and some sectors are improving while others are still lagging well behind. Services is one of those areas that I think is probably the next place for challenge. Certainly there's a lot of services businesses going into China, and you really need to think about what IP it is that you're placing there. There will be requirements in terms of Chinese data that it must be held in China and all of those factors, but a lot of that can be managed while protecting your IP. So you need to think about going in, how am I going to structure my interactions or my programs to ensure that we can, to the extent possible, protect what it is that is our crown jewels of the business.
Thanks, Murray, and thanks for touching on the services piece. That's certainly quite a challenge. I've got another question, but I just wanted to remind everyone on the webinar that they can submit their own questions by just typing them in to the program. So please feel free to do that. Watch Chris, if you're still on the line.
Hello, Alina?
Yes, thanks, Chris. Go ahead. Did you hear the question?
Oh, sorry. So you're asking what's the most important part of choosing a partner as in a debtor overseas? Yep, yes. I think that's a very good question. So obviously, I think what you're looking for really is a number of things, and one very important one is a track record. So as I mentioned in my talk today, getting some really robust data around who the company is and what they do. So obviously there's wherever country there is some level of mercantile agency information available, which will give you details around some important information around how old a company is, who its directors and shareholders are. In most cases, you'll have some kind of trade data as well. So I think that as a starting point, that's a really key point. Secondly, I think is very important to know the the people you're dealing with internally? You know, does it just come from an email overseas, or is it, have you had a conversation with this person? Have you had the opportunity to meet with them when you're in their market? I think knowing people is a lot stronger indication than just getting a random email through requesting your goods. And then thirdly, speak to people in your own market, or anyone with knowledge in that market about that specific people. Speak to people like your organisation, to other people in your industry that may have be trading in those regions or have traded with that specific buyer, and get some feedback on what they're like, what are the challenges been, and what kind of terms that they dealt with, and was there any payment issues?
Thank you, Chris. That's a fantastic response to that question, and a really important one as well. We are running close to time now, so I think I will wrap up the webinar for today. On behalf of the Export Council of Australia, I'd like to thank both Chris and Murray for their time today and their very valuable contribution to this issue. As I noted, we have recorded the webinar and we'll make it available. So thank you all.